All right, welcome everyone. It's just hit 4 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. I have the honor to introduce Eleanor Letts. Eleanor is an award-winning science designer from Seattle. She builds science infographics and data visualizations using colorful animations, complex data analysis, and open source code. Eleanor's work has been featured in Wired, The Washington Post, and Fast Company, and her past clients include National Geographic and Scientific American. Thank you all so much for coming. Eleanor, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for coming today. I know it's been a very long day for some of you. My name is Eleanor, and I'm an information designer. That means I make animated infographics like this one, which is showing you how grasshoppers breathe without having any lungs or blood vessels like we do. It's actually not a very efficient system, this tiny network of tracheae and air tubes that they're using, but it works for them because they're so small and they don't need a lot of oxygen. I've also done static illustrations, like these two infographics, which are showing you some of the variety of animals and plants in the bioluminescent tree of life. Finally, I also designed data-heavy graphics like this one, which is a geologic map of Mars. It's showing you all of the different types of ground surfaces and craters that scientists have observed on Mars. So these might all seem like very different projects with very different tools. But they're actually, for me, all of them are about making stories out of raw data and communicating them to everybody so they can understand. Today I want to share with you some of the solutions I've found that work for me in making the storytelling process easier. I'm going to first tell you a little about how I got into information design in the first place. Then I'll talk about two of the things that I think are the biggest challenges for me in communicating information, and some specific steps that I take to try and address those challenges. So first, I'll talk about those more generally using example projects with many different tools. But in the end, I'll also talk specifically about applying these solutions to data-heavy projects. So I got into making infographics more from the science side than from an art background. I got my bachelor's degree in molecular and developmental biology, where I studied how people and animals change and grow throughout their lives. So I've always been really fascinated by these tiny, awesome processes that are happening around us and in our bodies every day. For example, processes like reaching out to pick up a cup of coffee, where trillions of these tiny molecules and atoms are working together to make your movements look easy and effortless. Or how everyone sitting here today developed into a functioning human from just a tiny cluster of cells. This graphic is showing you the process of embryo development, starting with a fertilized egg at the top of the diagram and continuing throughout the entire process of embryo development until birth. So I think it's pretty astonishing that we all went through this very complicated process before we were even born. For me personally, design is a way to share these really exciting science stories with people in a way that uses color and animation and tries to decouple the technical jargon from what the science actually means. So when I'm making these infographics, there are two challenges that I try to think about and answer. The first challenge for me is really deciding what information to remove from the infographic. And I try to focus on what I can remove rather than what I'm actively putting in the first place. I think a great infographic really helps us focus on what's important by taking away the things that are less important or less relevant to the overall message. And for me, understanding my design audience is a big part of this, whether I'm designing just for my immediate supervisor or making a public-facing project for a bigger audience. The second challenge is picking a design style that complements the data. In my projects, I want to use design to make the data seem more visually exciting, to draw people in to engage with the information. I want the art and the design to work together kind of like a natural conversation, rather than being two disjointed parts of one project. So between these two challenges, I want to first talk about the challenge of curating information, of removing things that I don't need. This is always the first step for me when I'm making an infographic. And it's always very intertwined with me with the process of trying to understand what my audience needs from that specific design. To give you a more concrete example, here's a great example of a scientific figure with way too much information. So I didn't make this. This is a diagram of all the chemical reactions that can happen when you eat food and turn it into energy. So different things are happening based on if you eat a sugar or a protein or a combination of many different things. And I love it that when you zoom down far enough, we all look like this very interconnected, complicated alien universe. But as much as I really like this figure, it's a little too much information for anyone to process at once. A useful infographic would definitely not include all of this information. So the first thing I do when I'm trying to plan an infographic is to think about who my audience is and what they need. And depending on the audience, that can mean very different things. This is an infographic I designed that takes these same molecular pathways and turns them into a poster for medical students. It's part of a larger collection of posters I designed for a company called Nerdcore Medical. The point of this project was to make a series of 20 posters that could help explain important medical subjects to students who are studying for their licensing exam. So that's a pretty specific audience with a very detailed goal. Because the audience is so specific, there's actually a lot of information I'm still keeping in the graphic. I've removed many of the pieces of the molecular puzzle, but of the pieces that I included, I'm still keeping in all of the molecule names, the structures, the pathways that connect them, and even the amount of energy required for each step. And these are all things I would remove for a more general audience. But since medical students actually need to know all of this information, that was really the deciding factor in what I could include in this graphic. So, as I said, the molecule infographic was part of a series of 20 posters. And while I was trying to understand my audience for this graphic, I actually went through a very long process of discussing this with Arun Matthews, who was my collaborator on the project. Arun was a medical doctor, so he'd actually gone through the process of being a medical student and taking the exam, so he knew more than me about what it was these students needed. After discussing this for a while, we decided to really focus in on two specific goals for our audience. The first goal, of course, was that these needed to be study materials, so we needed to accurately represent the medical information they would need. To meet this goal, both of us went through the same kinds of study books and test prep materials that these medical students would be reading for their exam. But for our second goal, we also wanted to keep in mind that our customers were these college-age students, and we wanted to persuade them that these were interesting posters that they should buy and put in their dorm rooms. So we needed to make the posters decorative and fun and exciting enough to make it more than just a study tool. So it turned out that our main challenge for this project was to really combine both of these very different goals of our audience. So for example, in this infographic about heart development, we decided to very accurately illustrate the anatomy of the heart itself in the center to meet the information needs of our audience. But we also decided to remove all of the developmental information for other organs, like the lungs or the kidney. And by removing this, we were able to meet the decorative needs of our audience as well by substituting decorative pictures for those organs instead and focusing the chart only on the heart. Sometimes these two goals were not too hard to couple together. This infographic explains the process of wound healing at the cellular level. So it starts out with an injury and then follows the progression of healing all the way to the end of the process. So this linear story format really already fit into many other kinds of visual story formats, like this comic book style that we used for the project. But for other topics, we really had to reach pretty far to combine these two audience goals. This is an infographic about around 30 different statistical terms that medical students need to know. So statistical terms, and especially a list of vocabulary words, doesn't lend itself very easily to a graphic. So after discussing multiple design options, what we decided to do was to take this list of 30 not particularly well-related words and divide them into a general hierarchy of 3 different groups. The first group was about statistical terms that would be applied when understanding an individual patient. The second group was for terms that describe disease at the population level. And the third group of terms referred to clinical trials and drug trials that would be aimed towards actually curing or preventing the disease itself. By organizing the information in this way, we were then able to carry that forward into the design process itself. Now that we had a hierarchy of 3 different subjects, it was much easier to find a design that fit that style. For example, in this case, we decided to make a visual hierarchy of a city and a suburb and a rural village. I think this information editing is particularly important when there's many different ways to visualize the same information. This poster describes about 60 different viruses that can infect people. But there are a lot of different ways that you can arrange these 60 viruses. You could arrange them in a family tree of how they're more or less connected to each other. You could arrange them by how dangerous these viruses are, or by how you might start to treat the disease. When I have an open-ended problem like this, I try to list out each of the different possible ways of visualizing the information and listing how each one addresses the needs of the audience. So when I did this, I realized that medical students don't really need to know the relationship between individual viruses. They're not really looking at them from a biological perspective. What I did instead was to divide the viruses into just 3 major groups. The bottom section is made up of viruses that infect human cells using RNA. And the top 2 groups are viruses that infect human cells using DNA. For this project, we actually didn't want to create too many subdivisions because medical students needed to know every single one of these viruses. We didn't want to imply that some of them were more important to learn than others. So we wanted to pick an information visualization method that kind of put the same amount of importance for each one. And these information needs of the audience and the information that we decided to show really ended up driving the design of the poster as well. It helped us decide to connect all of the viruses in a more amorphous blob-like hierarchy instead of directed arrows or something that pointed out individual entries. And it helped us decide on a color scheme that didn't really emphasize major differences between the groups themselves. So throughout the process of making all of these posters, these were the 2 goals about my audience that I was trying to answer. Okay, so to recap, when I first planned an infographic, I tried to let the audience determine the amount of information I should include. And this is a fairly involved process that includes talking to people and reading the kinds of materials they work with every day. And understanding this information naturally leads to the design decisions that carry forward through the rest of the project. Okay, and that brings me to the graphics part of my talk. Once I have the information organized, once I have the data, then I get to work on the really fun challenge of visualizing it. This is my favorite part. I think it's a very open-ended challenge because data and design can do so many things. But depending on how you visualize it, the design can make information seem more familiar or friendly or more interesting, or make a difficult topic feel more personal. So my specific goal for the design of each project is a little bit different, but in all of them, I try to be more intentional about what I'm doing with the design. I want to go back to this molecular pathway diagram as an example. What really strikes me about the image and the information here is the tiny scale at which everything is happening. These molecules are so small that they're really different in the way we understand them from the things we can see and touch on an everyday basis. So when I turned this topic into a design, I wanted to pick a design style that really emphasized this difference in scale from what we can usually identify around us. And this idea of extreme size reminded me of these old constellation charts. So molecules and stars are kind of on the opposite extremes of size compared to humans. They're either so big or so small that we have a hard time understanding them. And even though the idea of molecules is a pretty recent development, we've been looking at the stars for thousands of years and thinking of these different ways of visualizing the information. So when I made this infographic, I decided to use a visual style that kind of reminded me of stars. Each atom is a glowing orb, and they're connected together, kind of like constellations. So I really like these kinds of visual pairings of the information with a somewhat related visual design style. And I try to pick design styles that complement something I already see in the data, even if it's not directly, literally related. And when I pair these two distinct things together, what I'm really trying to do is highlight the warmth or the personality behind scientific information. I think a lot of the time, scientists are portrayed as these very serious people in white lab coats with clipboards. But I don't really think the science or the information is about this serious environment. I think it's really about how we all want to understand where we came from, or what's going on around us, or what might happen to us in the future. I don't think science is a cold, technical field. I think it's a very warm expression of human curiosity, and I want to use design to bring out those parts of the data. So I've tried to address the same goal in many different visual stories. This is a series of virus trading cards that I designed using open data. Here, I'm showing you the protein structure that surrounds the genetic material inside of virus. On the very left is the dengue virus, which is transmitted by mosquitoes. On the right is one of the higher risk strains of the HPV virus. And in the center is a type of giant virus that infects green algae. So when designing this project, I spent a long time trying to figure out how I could make virus proteins seem more approachable and interesting. Traditional molecule visualizations usually show each molecule in a vacuum, and this was exactly what I didn't want to do with my design. I wanted to connect each of the different viruses together into a cohesive whole. So here I'm showing you one of the more traditional ways of visualizing this. This is from the online protein data bank page where I downloaded the structural data. And the software I used to visualize these molecules, called UCSF Chimera, was also mainly intended to look at each virus as its individual unit and not as part of a large collection. So I needed to step outside of the raw data and outside of this scientific program in order to find a way to connect these individual molecules. In the end, I decided to illustrate each virus as a collectible trading card. So to me, the excitement of finding a rare trading card is something that everyone can really relate to, even if you're not particularly interested in virus protein structure itself. And this idea was also inspired by these cigarette trading cards from the 1920s. So in the 1920s, I read that these trading cards were included in cigarette boxes, and you could collect any number of cards that were about flowers or fire trucks or famous actors. And I wanted to play off this concept of having something that's not actually very good for you, but it's still kind of collectible and kind of visually interesting if you step back and look at them from a distance. Another example of pairing a visual style with the information is this animated butterfly infographic. So this project was inspired by illustrations from 19th century naturalists, like these insect drawings on the right. So these days, we have photography and 3D scanners and video and all kinds of things to document our new scientific discoveries. And scientists don't have to draw all of their discoveries anymore. But with this project, I wanted to think about what a 19th century naturalist might do if they had modern design technology but weren't able to photograph these specimens directly. So it's kind of like a fun thought experiment, but it's also a design style that reminds me of the very long history of science and naturalists, and that the people who were studying science hundreds of years ago cared about the natural world in very much the same way we do today. Okay, so finally, this is an infographic I worked on with Wired about fire ecology. The audience here is the general public, and I illustrated 6 examples of plants that have evolved unique adaptations to wildfire. So each plant is well known scientifically and represents a unique and different type of adaptation. There's a giant sequoia tree, which has very thick bark that can withstand minor wildfires. Or the fireweed plant, which grows very well and very quickly in the open fields left behind after a fire. Or the California black oak, which can regrow from their extensive root systems even if the entire top of the tree has been burned by a fire. All of these examples illustrate very different aspects of fire adaptation. In this infographic, I'm limiting the number of stories to just 6 plants instead of 60 viruses like the medical posters I showed you earlier. A general audience is much more diverse than just medical students, so I wanted to make fewer stories and put much more detail into each one so I could make sure I could reach everybody and inform them in the same way. Okay, I've been talking a lot about how information editing for my audience can constrain the design choices I make. But I think this was an example of a project where it actually allowed me to experiment more with interesting design styles. So I actually made this infographic with real paper and fire. And I was only able to do that because I was designing for a general audience. This meant that I could remove a lot of specific details, like the plant colors, the number of seeds, where each plant's habitat was located. This didn't have to be a plant identification guide for scientists. So that gave me a lot more room to experiment with the visual style, and I was able to actually sculpt these paper sculptures out of paper. Then I set the sculptures on fire and videotaped the burning process so I could turn it into a looping animation. Obviously, using real flames and fire is not the most conventional way to illustrate plants, but it helped me emphasize the point of the story, which was the really important role that fire played in the life cycle of all of these species. And this is something I wouldn't have been able to do if I was designing this for a scientific audience. But I also found something unexpected from working on this project. When I showed other people the design, many people were much more interested in the process of how I'd made the design than in the actual science itself. So I wasn't expecting this because the entire time I was working on this infographic, I was focused on how to communicate these ideas about fire ecology and how to better understand them. And in the end, the animation did end up in the Wired Online article and in print in American Scientist. But when the story first came out in Wired magazine, the story was also more about how I made the graphic and less about the science itself. So for me, this was a very valuable collaboration because it showed me that sometimes what other people valued about my work wasn't what I originally intended with the science. For example, I've been working on this project to show the California black oak can regrow really quickly after a fire. But a lot of people were more interested in learning that all you need to make these paper sculptures is rough watercolor paper, Elmer's glue, and a craft knife. I also wanted to talk about how California lilac seeds can't germinate at all until they've been burned by a fire. But other people wanted to see that each of these California lilac flowers were individually folded. So this vial is about the size of my thumb, and here I'm showing you the flowers inside of the vial right before I glued on the tiny anthers shown right in front of it. So at first, I was a little disappointed that people were more interested in the art than in this really cool science about forest fires. But then I realized that when people asked about the design and engaged with the project from that perspective, they did also end up learning a little bit about fire ecology. So as I work on different design projects, and especially projects for the general public, I try to keep in mind that a visual story can help bring my information to a much larger audience than who is only interested in the data itself. Okay, so to recap, the two questions I try to answer for every infographic is what information can I remove for this specific audience? And then how can I find a visual story that ties into something important about the data itself? Okay. For the last part of my talk, I'd like to discuss how I've applied these ideas to data visualization in particular. So I think large data sets need a few more targeted solutions than what I've already discussed because data has many more technical limitations. And as an example, I'd like to talk about a series of astronomy maps I made recently using open data. So these are a few examples of different open source maps and data sets published by NASA and the USGS. For my own project, I wanted to take this open data that had been collected by many different scientific teams across many decades and turn them into a fresh new collection of maps for the general public. And this project was important to me because it was really kind of the story of how I got into using data and data analysis in my design work. So I want to talk briefly about how I developed the design ideas behind the project and learned the skills I needed to make these maps. And then I'll share two maps that were particularly challenging from a technical perspective and the different solutions I went through to solve the issues I found in the data. Okay, so going back to the visual story, when I first started this project, my goal was to find a visual story that could tie together all of these very distinct and different data sets. And I was particularly inspired by these hand-drawn ink maps from the 18th century. I really love the blank spaces on all of these maps, where people just hadn't been to the South Pole, the deep seas, and were leaving all of these spaces blank for other people to fill in. These days, we know a lot more about Earth, but we're still trying to fill in the blanks in our solar system and beyond. So I decided that this would be a great visual story to attach to the data I was working with. This is my very first map in the project, where I first started exploring really data visualization as data. And I started exploring this idea of applying this medieval design theme to these NASA maps. So this was my first one, and it was an extremely time-intensive project that I did mostly by hand. And to explain a little about the process, to design this map in a medieval style, I first printed out this poster that was designed by NASA, and then I traced every single one of these topographic layers by hand on tracing paper. Then I scanned each layer and added color manually in Photoshop for every single layer. I also found a different relief map of Mars published by NASA, and I added that on top to add more texture. And probably the most time-consuming part of this project was typing out the name of every single one of these craters by hand and spell-checking each of them. So when I finished the design, I was happy with the visual style and kind of the result of the map, but I knew that I needed to bring data analysis and more code into my design workflow. For my second attempt, this is a topographic map of Venus, And for those of you who didn't know, everything on Venus except for 3 places is named after either a famous woman or a goddess. So in this map, I've labeled each of the features with the name origin right underneath. So at this point, I decided I for sure wasn't going to be hand-drawing topographic lines anymore. So I removed that and tried a different visual style. So this style was a different one that I thought of based on Cold War designs and kind of are inspired by the space race era. But in the end, I was still typing each of these names by hand and spell checking them, and that was really the most time-consuming part of the process. So I ended up shelving this map project while I learned a little more about handling data. So then I went to grad school and learned how to code in Python. And all of a sudden, I could design space maps in the original medieval style that I had been going for, but still spend much less time on each map. So this was a huge change for me in how I worked with data and information. The biggest difference was definitely in labeling the map. Now, instead of doing this by hand, I could import the data from NASA and plot each of the names on the map in the correct location, and even scale things like the size of the feature names by the geographic size of the feature itself. I also didn't have to rely on tracing illustrated maps published by NASA. I could download the original data itself and manipulate the digital elevation model into different map projections, change the shadow angles and the lighting to make the kind of map I was looking for. I also used the data itself to draw topographic lines and fill them in using the color gradients I wanted to use. There was still a lot that I designed by hand. I added the shadow effects later in Photoshop by hand, and I also illustrated the decorative border. But in the end, even these time-consuming illustration steps were much less work because I could reuse them for other maps in the same style. And this was because my code relied on just a few lines in a configuration file to make each of these topographic maps. So when I wanted to make additional maps in the exact same style, all I needed to do was change a few lines in this configuration file. And then I could make an entirely new map using the exact same kind of data before a different planet. So this is a map of Mercury, where all of the craters are named after famous artists. And a map of the moon, where the craters are named after famous explorers and scientists. I could even expand the original code quickly to build new styles that were somewhat related. So this is an animated map of the seasons of Earth, where every single frame shows 1 month in a calendar year. Learning to work mainly in code meant that I still spent a lot of time on the design side of the project at the beginning. But once that style was established, I could quickly branch out and make related projects with much less time and effort. So working with code was a very big change for my design style. And I learned to actively look for new tools that could work with the data I had instead of relying what I already knew. But the open data I was working with also came with some unique problems I hadn't encountered before. So I want to show you 2 final maps where I struggled the most with managing the data and the specific solutions I used for each of these issues. And this first map shows 18,000 asteroid orbits in the solar system. This was a very technically challenging project because of the huge amount of data. And even though all of this data is part of the same map, it came from 5 different data sets. I had to merge them together, and there was also many different issues with the data itself. So my approach here was to break down all of these data issues into smaller problems and solve each one independently from the rest. For example, the map looks something like this when I first downloaded the data from NASA. I've scaled up the size of each asteroid here so you can still see some of them, but even so, the data is really difficult to interpret and understand. The issue here is that there are a ton of asteroids in the inner solar system and many fewer ones on the outer edges. So to solve this specific problem with the data, what I decided to do was reproject my map from a linear distance scale to a radial logarithmic scale. Because this was a static map, I needed to focus on the part of the solar system that had the most data. So this map focuses on the first billion kilometers from the sun, which is where most of the asteroids are in the main asteroid belt. But because it's a logarithmic scale, you can still see the Kuiper belt and other asteroids in the outer edges of the solar system. My second problem was visualizing the size of each of these asteroids. Here I'm showing the true diameter of each asteroid in comparison with each other, again scaled up. But you can see that there's such a huge range in the size of these objects that it's very difficult to see the smaller ones when the larger ones are taking up a huge amount of the map. So to make this data more legible, I used a different logarithmic scale. Here you can still see some of the differences between the asteroids, but there's much less overlap, and you can still see the number of asteroids in each part of the asteroid belt. There are also many asteroids in the solar system that scientists have located, but not been able to measure their exact size. I really wanted to include all of these asteroids, mostly because most of the objects in the outer solar system did not have an exact size. After looking at the data, I found that there are about 63,000 asteroids where we don't know the size. So this was a problem because this was much too many to add and make a legible static map. So as a compromise, I included 8,000 randomly selected asteroids from the selection of objects where we didn't know the size. Finally, I wanted to show the orbit paths of each of these objects. So overall, I was really surprised by the circular orbits that most of these asteroids were taking through the solar system. So I really wanted to highlight that pattern in the map, and this was the feature of the data that I wanted to highlight. But when I made each orbit tail the same length and time, I found that I really couldn't emphasize this feature in the outer solar system without overplotting everything in the inner solar system, just because the objects in the outer solar system travel much less of a percentage of its orbit in the same time. So instead of making each orbit tail the same length, I decided to add a cap to the data that was being plotted so that at most, each asteroid was only showing a quarter of its actual orbit. And this was a design decision based on the feature of the data I wanted to emphasize, which was the circular shape of the orbits. Labeling the map also took a little creative problem solving. There wasn't enough space to label every single asteroid, so I compiled a list of the biggest asteroids and the most interesting ones that people have landed spacecraft on or otherwise investigated. Then I plotted each of these specific asteroids in Python and moved the labels around in Illustrator so that they were legible. This final asteroid map is a mix of many different solutions cobbled together. So when I have a huge data set like this to visualize with many different issues, it's much less overwhelming for me to group these problems with the data into what I think of are related bins and address each of these bins separately before combining everything at the end. When working with data, it's also much harder for me to decide what information my audience needs. This is because many data sets can be very large or include many different kinds of information. This constellation map was a project where I really needed to cut out a lot of data. For one thing, the Open Star database included more than 100,000 stars. So I first removed all of the stars except for the several thousand you can see from the Earth with the naked eye. But even reducing the number of stars, each one came with a lot of information. Each star had an approximate color and size or relative brightness from Earth. I could also include the scientific boundaries of constellations like Orion and Scorpio, and the more familiar shapes of asterisms, which are what we usually call constellations. I also wanted to label these shapes, label the named stars, and add in other things you can see from Earth, like nebulae and galaxies. At this point, the map is already very busy, even though I've removed the majority of the stars in the data set. But of course, there's still a lot of other information I could include, even when I'm limiting the data to just the stars you can see from Earth. In this map, I'm showing you the traditional Western constellations in the sky. But these lines are the stories invented by people, not scientific facts about the stars themselves. So I could have just as well showed you a map with the traditional Arabic patterns, or the traditional Chinese constellations, or the Korean ones, or the Hawaiian ones, or a combination of star patterns from every single culture I could find, which turned out to be about 30 cultures and civilizations from an open data set with public contributions. So I actually ended up making a second star chart for this project that shows the star patterns of each of these cultures around the world. When data is particularly complex, I might first start out with a map in mind of what I think the audience wants to know, or what I think is the most important part of the data. But when I get into the data itself, it often turns out to not be the case. So in these cases, I try to make multiple visualizations instead of putting everything important into one design. For large data sets, I also try to spend more time than usual to try and understand what specific things in the data my audience might be the most interested in. So pulling back from all these individual projects, I want to go back to the two overarching questions in information design that I try to address in my design work. So from an information perspective, I spend a lot of time trying to understand what information my audience needs to know, and then selectively removing everything else. Sometimes for complex data, the audience might need several different graphics, and then I try to answer that question separately for each one. And from a design perspective, I think art is a powerful tool that can make a story more relatable. I think design can help reinforce the warm human side of data and add a story that draws people in, even if they aren't particularly motivated to look at the data itself. And finally, I think the most powerful stories are the ones where the data and the art are working together to tell the same message, and that both of them are indispensable parts of the same project. So that's really the kind of project I try to make, and those are the goals I try to answer with my design work. So I'd like to thank all of the people and organizations who've helped me with these projects, especially the organizations that have open sourced their code and data. I also want to point out that my code for all of these data viz maps are open sourced on GitHub, so please feel free to download the code and use it yourself. And thank you so much for taking the time to come listen to me today.